The sun hung low over Burkina Faso, casting golden rays over the rust-red rooftops of Ouagadougou. The streets buzzed with life, motorbikes weaving between vendors, children laughing in alleyways, and radios playing hopeful songs about a new future. But deep behind the walls of an old prison just outside the capital, time stood still for one man. For 7 long years he'd been locked away for a crime he didn't commit, forgotten by the world, abandoned by the system. No lawyer, no hearing. Just silence. What no one knew, not even the prison guards or the man himself, was that something extraordinary was about to happen. Something no one had ever seen from a sitting president. Because on that day, President Ibrahim Traore, the young and fearless leader of Burkina Faso, made a decision that would shake the foundations of justice in his country. He didn't send a convoy. He didn't make an announcement. There were no flashing cameras, no media teams following him. Just him, a few trusted guards, and a silent resolve. President Traore walked through the rusted iron gates of the prison, not as a man of power, but as a man of conscience. A leader who believed that change didn't always begin in government halls. Sometimes it began in the quiet corners where no one was looking. And this prison, was one of those places. Inside those walls, hope had long vanished. The prisoners rarely looked up anymore. Their eyes were dull, their backs bent with defeat. Among them was a man whose name had been erased from court files, whose voice had been ignored for years. He wasn't a criminal. He was a farmer, a father, a man who'd simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. And because of that, his entire life had been stolen. But President Traore had heard whispers. He'd been told about a prisoner who cried in silence, who still prayed every morning for justice even when the world had turned its back. Most politicians would have ignored such a rumor, but not Traore. He remembered his own childhood, growing up in the countryside, watching friends and neighbors suffer because no one cared enough to fight for them. He swore he'd be different. As he walked through the narrow corridors of the prison, the guards whispered in disbelief. Was it really the president? What was he doing here without cameras or security detail? But Traore didn't slow down. He wasn't here to make a statement. He was here for a man who didn't even know he was about to see sunlight again. Cell after cell passed. Traore looked into the faces of men, some hardened, some broken, until he stopped in front of one door. The man inside looked up, confused. His beard was thick, his eyes sunken, his hands calloused. He didn't recognize the figure outside the bars at first. Why would he? No one important ever came here. Traore didn't say much. He simply asked the man's name, then asked him to stand. The guards looked at each other, unsure of what was happening. The man slowly rose to his feet, his legs shaking. He hadn't stood tall in years, and then the unimaginable happened. The president of Burkina Faso opened the cell door himself. There was silence. The kind of silence that only happens when something impossible unfolds before your eyes. No one moved. Even the wind outside seemed to stop. For 7 years, this man had waited for a miracle, and now the highest power in the country had come to give it to him, not with words, not with promises, but with action. But this story doesn't end here, because freedom is never simple. Justice isn't always clean, and even a president can't erase the past with one decision. What Traore didn't know, and what the man didn't expect, was that outside those prison gates, forces were moving. The truth about what really happened 7 years ago was more twisted than anyone could imagine. It wasn't just a case of mistaken identity. There were people who wanted him silenced, people with secrets to protect and power to lose. As President Traore led the man out into the sunlight, the story was only beginning. Who was this man really? What crime had he been blamed for? And what would happen now that he was free? Would the truth finally come out, or would old shadows rise again to bury it? This wasn't just an act of kindness. It was the start of something much bigger, something that could bring justice to the forgotten or danger to the one who dared to remember them. And somewhere Someone was watching, waiting, afraid of what the man might say. Stay with us, because in the next part the truth begins to unravel, and what you'll hear next might just change everything you thought you knew about justice, and what it takes to stand up against a broken system. The echoes of footsteps bounced off the cold, bare prison walls as President Ibrahim Traore stood silently in the courtyard, his eyes fixed on the man before him, a man named Musa. 7 long years had passed since Musa was imprisoned, for a crime he never committed. His face, though tired and lined with sorrow, still held a quiet strength. He had once been a school teacher, known in his community for his kindness and passion for education. But all of that was stripped away in a single moment when he was accused of a theft that shocked the entire village. Back then, the media had covered the case only briefly, and most people quickly forgot about it. But not Musa, and not his aging mother, who knocked on every door, wrote letter after letter, and begged for someone, anyone, to listen. She believed in her son's innocence with all her heart. But the system was broken. The evidence was weak. The investigation rushed. And Musa, a poor man without powerful connections, was forgotten. President Ibrahim Traore had recently launched a quiet initiative, a personal mission to review past judicial cases that had signs of injustice. He believed that leadership wasn't just about policies and speeches. It was about showing up for the people, even when no one was watching. He came across Musa's case late one night, reading through faded documents and incomplete testimonies. Something didn't sit right. Why had the trial ended so quickly? Why was there no follow-up on the missing security footage? And why had the main witness disappeared soon after? The deeper he dug, the more he realized this wasn't just one man's tragedy. It was a symptom of a deeper problem. A justice system overwhelmed, underfunded, and at times manipulated. Musa's case was now more than just paperwork. It was a symbol of what could go wrong when no one is held accountable. As Traore's team started reinvestigating, they found cracks everywhere. The supposed eyewitness had changed his statement multiple times. The original prosecutor had a history of misconduct. And most shockingly, a security officer who worked in the building where the theft took place confessed in a private interview that the whole incident had been misunderstood. The real culprit? A well-connected businessman who had quietly fled the country years ago. But what truly haunted the president was the thought of Musa waking up every day in a cell, watching the seasons change through a tiny barred window, carrying the weight of a lie. When he finally came to the prison that day, it wasn't for a media stunt. There were no cameras, just a man standing in front of another, saying with his presence, "I see you, I believe you." As the guards opened the cell door, Musa didn't move. He stared in disbelief, unsure if this was real or just another cruel twist in a long nightmare. The president reached out his hand, firm, steady, human, and in that moment, Musa stepped out. Not just from a prison cell, but from the shadows of a stolen life. Outside the prison, a small crowd had gathered, whispering stories of what might be happening. No one knew for sure, but inside those walls, something powerful had just begun. Not just freedom for Musa, but a call for truth, for reform, for justice. But the story doesn't end here. Because while Musa was now free, his name was still tainted. His village had moved on. His school was closed. His mother, though filled with tears of joy, was frail from years of pain. And President Traore knew that real justice wasn't just about unlocking a door. It was about rebuilding what had been broken. Back at the palace, Traore called an emergency meeting. He ordered a full audit of past criminal convictions, focusing on cases involving the poor and powerless. He set up an independent board, lawyers, human rights activists, community leaders, to examine the truth. But not everyone was happy. Whispers grew louder in the political corridors. Some feared what else might be uncovered. Some warned that this would bring chaos. And some, those with the most to lose, began plotting in silence. Meanwhile, Musa was trying to adjust to freedom. But freedom, after so many years of chains, felt strange. He walked through streets that once knew his name, now filled with unfamiliar faces. Children stared. Old friends avoided eye contact. The hardest part wasn't the prison walls. It was the silence outside them. The silence of people who had moved on or worse still believed the lies. One evening a journalist came to meet Musa. She had followed his story for years, quietly documenting his mother's fight. She offered him a chance to speak, not just for himself, but for others still waiting behind bars, still waiting to be heard. Musa hesitated, unsure if anyone would care. But deep down, he knew that truth, once set free, had its own power. As the story began to gain traction, more people started coming forward. Former inmates with similar stories, families with unanswered questions, even whistleblowers within the system. What started as one man's freedom had now become a movement, but just as the light began to shine, shadows crept in. One night, an anonymous letter arrived at the president's desk. Short, cold, a warning: stop digging, or you'll regret it. The story was far from over, and the fight for justice had just begun. Would President Traore back down under pressure? Would Musa find the strength to lead others like him? Or would the forces hiding in the dark succeed in burying the truth again? That answer is coming in the next part. President Ibrahim Traore sat in his office, the anonymous warning letter still resting on the corner of his desk. Outside, the capital buzzed like usual, but inside the walls of the palace, tension had begun to creep in. Some senior officials were growing nervous. The review committee he had formed had now uncovered over a dozen cases that mirrored Musa's. Innocent men locked away, evidence ignored, voices silenced. The president was shaking the very foundation of a system that had long benefited from silence. But Traore wasn't the kind of man who gave in to fear. He had promised his people honesty and justice. And now, with the world watching, he couldn't turn back. He ordered an investigation into the people who handled Musa's case, the former judge, the prosecutor, even the missing businessman, and slowly, pieces of the puzzle began to surface. Records that had been hidden away, bank transfers tied to bribes, and testimonies from people who had once been too afraid to speak. The deeper they went, the more dangerous it became. One night, while Musa was returning from a quiet community event, a car tried to run him off the road. He wasn't hurt, but it was clear. Someone didn't want him alive. The message was loud and clear: back off. But Musa didn't back off. In fact, the attack pushed him to speak louder. He agreed to a live interview, broadcast across the nation, where he calmly shared his story. His voice didn't shake, even as he talked about years spent in a dark cell, birthdays missed, the pain of watching his mother age without him. The interview went viral. People across Burkina Faso and beyond began talking. Hashtags like China Justice for Musa and China Traore Truth started trending. Citizens who had stayed silent for years started sharing their own stories. Suddenly, it wasn't just about Musa. It was about everyone who had suffered under an unfair system. But behind the scenes, the pressure was building. A group of powerful figures, including a few high-ranking officials from the past government, were desperate to stop the wave of change. They tried to discredit Musa, claiming he was making everything up. They accused President Traore of using this for political gain. But the people weren't fooled. The truth had found its voice. Then came the breakthrough. The businessman, who had fled the country, the real culprit behind the theft Musa was blamed for, was located in a coastal town in a neighboring country. With help from regional allies, President Traore arranged for his extradition. The man was brought back in secret and questioned. At first he denied everything, but when confronted with evidence were old emails, payment trails, recorded conversations, he broke. He confessed not only to the crime, but to having paid off the prosecutor and manipulated the entire case. The news hit the country like a storm. Musa was finally and officially cleared of all charges. His name restored. His case became a national example of why justice matters. The president stood beside him in a press conference and announced sweeping reforms: better legal aid for the poor, transparency in trials, and independent oversight over every major case going forward. As for Musa, he didn't want revenge. He asked for only one thing: a chance to rebuild. President Traore offered him a post as an advisor on justice reform, but Musa politely declined. "I want to go back to the classroom," he said with a small smile. "That's where I belong." And so he did. A few weeks later, Musa walked into a school not far from where he had grown up. Children gathered around him wide-eyed as he began to teach not just math or history, but the value of truth and the strength of never giving up. The story of Musa and President Ibrahim Traore became a symbol of hope across Africa, not because everything was perfect now, but because someone in power had chosen to do the right thing, and someone forgotten had chosen to keep believing. In the end, justice wasn't just about freeing one man. It was about changing a system, one step at a time. And though the road ahead would still be long, it had finally started, with courage, with truth, and with the belief that no one should ever be punished for a crime they didn't commit. That's the power of standing up, whether you're a president, a teacher, or a mother who never stops fighting for her child. And that is where this story ends. But for many others, it's just the beginning.